Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, Jesus and his disciples are sitting on the Mount of Olives when the disciples ask Jesus 3 questions. The first questions the disciples ask of Jesus is, when will these things happen? We've already seen that these things refers to the judgment to come upon the Pharisees and the religious leaders and the destruction of the temple. Charles Spurgeon says, the disciples inquired first about the time of the destruction of the temple. Jesus answers this question in Matthew 24, verses 4 through to 28. You might like to pause this video now and read these verses. Now, most of us read this assuming that Jesus is giving a prophecy about the end of the world, because that is all that we have been taught. It might surprise you to know that there's a large percentage of Christian scholars who do not see this prophecy about our future, but rather that it prophetically describes the end of the Old Covenant. Jesus responds to this question of the disciples, and he tells them the things that would occur before the destruction of the city and the temple, before the Old Covenant is done away with for good. We see here that Jesus has prophesied judgment upon the Pharisees and religious leaders, but he also gives them a warning of what must occur first. Jesus responds to the disciples' first question with 8 signs that will lead to the coming judgment and destruction of Jerusalem. Let's look at these 8 signs. The first one can be found in verse 5. Jesus tells the disciples, before this judgment comes, before Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed, that many would come claiming to be Christ and would deceive many. The reality was that right after the death of Jesus, many believers gave up believing that he was the Messiah, and other leaders rose up who captured the hearts of many. Of all the different times and ages throughout history, the first generation probably saw more false messiahs than probably any other. Another sign, verse 6 and 7. Jesus said that there would be wars and rumours of wars. It's interesting that Jesus declared wars and rumours of wars during the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which was the only time in history that war had essentially ceased because the empire had conquered all enemies. Yet within a generation, war began to break out all over the empire, with 50,000 Jews killed in Cilicia, 20,000 in Samaria, 50,000 in Alexandria. More signs, verse 7, Jesus says that there would be famines. Now, Acts 11 tells us of the great famine that occurred in the reign of Claudius during his 4th year. It extended through Greece and even into Italy, but was felt most in Judea and especially Jerusalem. Joseph, the Jewish historian, he paints a very graphic picture of the horror of what was called the Great Famine. Other famines occurred in the 1st and 11th years of Claudius's reign. Verse 7, Jesus talks of earthquakes. The few years prior to the fall of Jerusalem was a time of unusually high seismic activity, with the most famous earthquake being the destruction of Pompeii in AD 63. Verse 8 tells us that these are the beginnings of the birth pangs. Now, by using the word birth pangs, Jesus connects with Jewish eschatological language. There are Old Testament passages that link birth pangs to the judgment on a city or nation. Hosea is one such example. In Hosea chapter 13, Hosea speaks of the pangs of childbirth coming upon the northern kingdom of Israel when the city of Samaria is destroyed and the people taken into exile. Now, first century Jews would have heard these words and associated them with impending judgment. And the judgment that Jesus is referring to here is the judgment on Jerusalem for its rejection of Christ. We see another sign, verse 9. Jesus said that there would be persecution. The first persecution was instigated by the Jewish religious leaders, Saul being among those leaders who oversaw the men putting Christians to death. This persecution became even more intense in AD 64, where more than 1/3 of Rome was burned to the ground. Nero blamed the Christians for the fire and begins what church historians call the Great Persecution, where thousands of Christians were tortured by being covered in animal skins and torn to death by dogs, or covered in tar and lit on fire to illuminate Nero's gardens. Paul himself was scourged by the Jews 5 times. History shows that many gave their lives for the gospel. Stephen was stoned to death. James, he was beheaded in AD 44 at the hands of Herod. Peter and Paul themselves were martyred in Rome around AD 67 to 68. In verse 11, we are told that many false prophets would appear. The reality is that in this first century, many believers stepped away from love of Christ and became Gnostics, Judaizers, and Nicolaitans. One scholar wrote, "We generally think of the apostolic period as a time of tremendously explosive evangelism and church growth, a golden age where astounding miracles took place every day. That's mainly correct," he says, but it is flawed by one glaring omission. He says that we tend to neglect the fact that the early church was the scene of the most dramatic outbreak of heresy in world history. These heresies became an increasing subject of apostolic counsel and pastoral oversight. Again and again, the apostles found themselves issuing stern warnings against tolerating false teachers and false apostles. In verse 11, we're also told that lawlessness will increase, and this became a major theme throughout the first century. Then in verse 14, we're told that the gospel would be preached to all the world. This is a key verse that dispensationalists use to tell us that these verses are for our future. We're told that this has not yet happened. Yet interestingly, in Romans 1:8, Paul talks to the Romans saying, "I thank God for all of you because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world." Romans 10 verse 18 says, "Their voice has gone into all the earth, and their words to the ends of the worlds." The truth is that the gospel was indeed preached to the whole known world. In verse 14, Jesus says that after these things, the end will come. This is answering the question of the disciples in verse 3 of chapter 24. Remember, the disciples asked, "When will the judgment you've just been talking about come? When will Jerusalem and the temple be destroyed?" Jesus is saying that after these things have happened, then the judgment that he prophesied about in chapter 23 will come. After these things, after the wars, famines, earthquakes, after the gospel is going out into the known world, then the end of the age, the old covenant age, will come. All these things occurred prior to AD 70, just as Jesus had prophesied. With the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, we see the end of the old covenant system that had kept God veiled. This is the end that Jesus is talking about. Let's take a look now at verse 15 and 16 of Matthew 24, where Jesus talks about an abomination that causes desolation. And he says to his disciples, "When you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, then let all those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Now this can be confusing until we look at the corresponding passages in Luke chapter 21, where Luke clarifies things for us. Luke 21 verse 20 says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know that desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." The abomination that causes desolation refers to Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, which occurred in AD 70 before the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. When you see the abomination that causes desolation, Jesus says, then flee to the mountains. Now that's really interesting, because the natural tendency upon seeing an approaching army would be to flee into Jerusalem for safety. Jesus here gives his disciples a clear sign of when Jerusalem would be destroyed, so they could get out of Jerusalem, so they could flee to the mountains. Why? So the gospel would be protected. How dreadful it would be in those days, he said. Jesus tells us that this time will be a time of great distress, unequalled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equalled again. Futurists tell us that these verses relate to a supposed tribulation in our future. But when we read the parallel account of Jesus' prophecy in Luke, it's very apparent that Jesus is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Roman army in AD 70. Check out my video, AD 70, The Great Tribulation, to find out more.